Okay, with those preparatory things out of the way now, we can begin with the lecture. I will put the title of the lecture in the chat here. We are dealing with wisdom and poetic literature. This is our final lecture, as I said, and we are covering the last books of the Old Testament that we have not yet covered in other lectures. These books are normally grouped in a list of 5, and I can put these in the chat also to help you. Normally, the wisdom and poetic books are listed as Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. Now, sometimes there is a 6th book that is added, and that is the Book of Lamentations, which we will look at very briefly this evening at the end of our lecture. And it's also worth mentioning that for Catholics who have the Apocrypha as part of their Bible, or the Deuterocanonical books, there are 2 other books that are held in high esteem, and they are grouped in this category of wisdom, poetic literature. Those books are the Wisdom of Solomon and the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, or it's often just known in its short form, Sirach. And those are very important books, and especially in the type of research and the type of study that I do in the broader Christian tradition. These books come up fairly frequently, and sometimes they're quoted by church fathers will quote these books as they are quoting from the main books as well. Okay, so we are going to be discussing the main 5, focusing on the main 5 in our in the Protestant canon: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and we'll be looking at them in that order. I want to give a few introductory and kind of general remarks about the genre of wisdom literature. It's important for us to know why these books are important, especially in our contemporary, very technological and information-driven age. To many leaders, to many people, politicians, what have you, poetry and wisdom literature that seems to be perhaps less direct, perhaps a bit mysterious or opaque, not directly applicable to earning money or business strategies. They may think that this type of literature is not very useful, or is not very valuable, is not very important. I would argue that mindset, that perspective that our modern world has, makes the wisdom literature even more important, because our society is so starved of deep thinking, and we tend to neglect or to eschew ancient ideas, push them to one side. Okay. Nearly 1/3 of the Hebrew Old Testament is in the form of poetry. And that's not just referring to these books, although the books in question this evening do take up a lot of space in the Bible. As some of you may know, Job is quite a lengthy book. Psalms is quite a lengthy book. And so they take up a lot of space. But in other books that we've already looked at, there are frequently sections that include poetry or songs or passages of wisdom literature. So this genre is very, very important for the Hebrew people and for the ancient world more broadly. Another reason, perhaps, why the wisdom literature is often neglected in churches is because it is not easy always or simple to understand. Often it requires readers to think about things and to wrestle with ideas, to engage with complex and difficult questions. And I hope that you would remember, going back to one of our first lectures on the book of Genesis, the patriarchal period, about the story of Jacob before his name was changed to Israel, and the way that he wrestled with God. And that picture, which kind of summarizes the overarching mission or vocation of the people of Israel to continue to wrestle with God as they wrestle to obey him, as they strive to keep his commandments in a world that is pulling them away constantly, that is tempting them to do things that God does not want them to do. So this idea of wrestling fits quite well with the wisdom literature, I would argue. And we will get a little taste of that this evening as we look at some of the passages that tend to be perhaps a good modern example that may resonate with some of you is the idea of riddles or puzzles. The wisdom literature is not intended to be obtuse or difficult to understand on purpose. The idea is that the wisdom literature is tapping into deep and ancient truths. And the only way to understand these things is to really slow down and take a step back from the busyness of the world and try to see things that are not immediately apparent, okay? In the wisdom literature, young people are often associated or often described as fools, or I should say the fools are often young people. And this shouldn't surprise most of you, because in most cultures in the world, we have a general understanding that old people are often wise people because they have lived for many years, they have had experiences, they have overcome difficulties, they have overcome struggles, and that has given them a perspective that allows them to be wise, that allows them to see things that take a long time to see, or to understand things that take a long time to really grasp, okay? This means that wisdom literature is often shared and communicated in a generational or intergenerational manner. So we see, especially in the Book of Proverbs, over and over repeated the idea that a parent is passing on their wisdom to their child and trying to help the child avoid perhaps mistakes that they made, or to benefit from wisdom that was attained through a lot of difficulty, through a lot of struggle, okay? Wisdom literature was very important, not just for the Hebrew people, but throughout the ancient world. And it was regarded, especially in a time when written material was so expensive and so precious and so rare. The reason they chose to write these things down is because it represented a collection of wisdom that had been gathered, that had been carefully preserved throughout the ages. And the idea was that if people read this, they could benefit from all of the lessons that their predecessors had learned, okay? That is why wisdom literature was regarded in the ancient world as being so precious, sacred, even divine sometimes. There are just a few more introductory things that I want to say about this genre. It's important to get the basic foundation set. The Hebrew word for wisdom that we come across often is chokhmah, and it's good that we just talked about the prophets, because the wisdom literature is complementary to the messages that the prophets deliver. And it can be seen as kind of a juxtaposing type of understanding. By that, this is what I mean. Wisdom literature is different from the prophetic literature, which comes from the prophetic literature. The prophets receive the knowledge directly from God, spoken to them, given to them in visions or in dreams or by word of mouth. And it's often in the form of words, of commandments, of warnings, all these things we talked about last week with Reverend Kasoy, injunctions to behave in a certain way. The wisdom literature is not like that. It's not really directly from God. The idea is that wisdom literature comes from observing the world that God has created. And one of the most remarkable examples of wisdom in the whole Bible comes in the first few chapters of the Book of Proverbs. Therein, wisdom is personified as a female figure. And this figure talks about being present with God when God created the world. Wisdom was acting as a companion to God, providing the ideas and helping with the way that the universe was put together. And so because of this foundational idea that wisdom was there at the creation, followers of God in Israel and Christians after that have concluded that by looking at the creation that God has made, we can gain wisdom, because the God who made the universe, who made the world, is wise and was accompanied by wisdom in the process and set things up in a way that can help us understand the deeper realities of God. So this means that very often in the wisdom and poetic literature, we see references to the natural world. We will read about some of this in a few moments from the book of Job, but we read about animals. In Proverbs, it says to observe this animal or to observe the ant and how they work, and look at the stars and the moon and the plants and the seasons and how all of this fits together. And look at the way that humanity operates, okay? Because we can learn from the mistakes of others. We can learn that when righteous people obey God, they are blessed. We can learn that if somebody is treacherous or backstabbing or deceives other people, they reap the negative reward of that behavior, okay? So if the prophetic information and disclosures are coming directly from God through his prophets, the wisdom literature is coming from observation of the world and from humanity in the world, and it is being carefully preserved because it takes a long time. It takes often a lifetime to become wise. Wisdom is not something that can be attained quickly or easily or cheaply. Wisdom takes time, it takes hard work, and it is costly. It is costly to attain wisdom because it means we must sacrifice certain pleasures or certain naive assumptions about how the world around us operates. Okay. Last night when we were talking, we were trying to get to the bottom of what wisdom is, and several students provided some good ideas. And it's important to state that wisdom is complex, and the way that the wisdom literature talks about it is multifaceted. By that, I mean that we cannot just provide a simple definition for wisdom. So I'm going to give you a few ideas that can help construct what exactly this wisdom, this chokhmah is that we're talking about. The most important kind of foundational idea that comes across in the wisdom literature is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of understanding. And this is important for us in our context studying the Old Testament, because this is one of the key features that sets the Hebrew wisdom literature apart from the wisdom literature of other ancient cultures. Okay, as I said, other ancient societies in Egypt and in Mesopotamia had wisdom literature, but their wisdom was not as directly related to or submissive to God or the gods. It was more, we could say, perhaps humanistic in its endeavors. The Hebrew literature makes very clear that fear of the Lord is the beginning of understanding. And whatever we say about wisdom, it must be connected to God, and it must be given by God. That happens, of course, slowly over time, but wisdom is ultimately something that is given by God one way or another. There are also many, I talked about the complexity of wisdom, that is not easy to understand. It's not like you can just pluck the fruit from the tree and benefit from it right away. It often takes contemplation and meditation to benefit from the wisdom. And so many of the wisdom literature and the pieces of wisdom that are shared seem, on the surface at least, somewhat paradoxical. I want to give you an example from Proverbs 26:12 that serves as a good, important warning. It says this: "You have seen a man wise in his own opinion. There is more hope for a fool than for that man." So the idea that comes across here is that if you think you are wise, then you have missed the point. If you think you are wise, you may be in danger of actually being a fool. That is one of the mysterious components, something that causes people to approach this literature with reverence and with a deep sense of appreciation for the years and years that it took to collect this stuff. One last thing I want to say, and then I'll turn it over for a brief period of questions or comments. One way that I find it helpful to understand wisdom is the idea of knowledge being applied. This is not a hard and fast rule, but it's often the case that the wise person in these stories, in these examples, is somebody who knows what is right, but then acts upon it and puts that knowledge into practice. The fool, on the other hand, is often the person who knows the right thing to do, but they don't do it. So I, for instance, may know in my head or in my heart that I should be waking up early in the morning and eating healthy meals and exercising and getting enough sleep and all these types of things. But just because I know those things doesn't mean I'm able to put it into practice. So wisdom does not just relate to intellectual understanding, although that is part of it. It also relates to acting and behaving in wise ways that demonstrate not just the understanding of God's law, but the incorporation or the integration of God's law into our very ways of life, into our ways of living. Wisdom can refer, the word itself can refer to the specialized knowledge that somebody has, for instance, in working with wood or with metal. It can refer to collecting knowledge in the head, but it also heavily connects and relates to the idea of righteousness. We will see righteous and wickedness contrasted and juxtaposed in the wisdom literature that we're going to be studying. So that's a very basic introduction to the wisdom and poetic literature. I want to take a brief moment here to let you ask some questions, but first I want to turn it over. I believe I saw my colleague, Reverend Kasoy, jump on the call. Are you there, Reverend?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
How is everybody?
Doing well, I think.
Yeah, I would insist on the aspect of application of the knowledge. There is a lot of people with information, and there is a lot of book knowledge. But the application of that knowledge is what makes a huge difference.
Yes.
And so many people are learned. Many people go to school, they get degrees, but how they process that information and how they apply it in daily life is what makes for a huge difference.
Yes.
And so, as our lecturer has said, it is not enough to have information. It is how we apply that information in daily living. We have gained a lot of insight in this class on the Word of God, but how we move ahead to begin to apply that in solving daily problems will make a huge difference. And it will show whether we are learned or educated in how we go ahead and even allow that information to transform us and help us in relating with our parents, with our peers, and the different spheres of life. And so I wish everybody the best as we seek to apply more the insights that we have gotten, not only in this class, but in the various classes that we are involved in. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Kasoy, for that very helpful comment. Does anybody else want to comment or ask a question, or perhaps add a perspective about how you understand wisdom?
Can I say something?
Of course, go ahead.
I will say wisdom is a knowledge that surpasses the normalcy, beyond the normal.
Yes, that is a good way to put it. In fact, last night, one of the students described wisdom as matured knowledge, which is one way to understand it, because it represents the next level. Like Reverend Kasoy said, you don't just know things up here, but they actually help you live a better life. And in the context of the Bible, a life that is more pleasing to God, a more righteous life. Now, because almost 1/3 of the Old Testament is some type of poetry, as I said before, it is helpful for us to talk a little bit more about the structure and how that poetry operates. So we're going to talk about a form of poetry, Hebrew poetry, called parallelism. I've put that word in the chat, and it is very important for us to understand, because it one of the things this accomplishes is that the form of the wisdom literature itself suggests and communicates that the ideas contained within it are more than simply words on a page, more than just letters and typical types of writing. Okay, this is different than a newspaper or a textbook. This wisdom that is contained in these books is special, like Nora said. And so the way it is communicated and presented to readers is also special. And parallelism accomplishes this task of elevating the words by employing different structures to make us as readers reflect on the ideas and consider the instructions more carefully, and even to sometimes pause and question if we've understood what's being said correctly. There are three main types of parallelism that we encounter in the Hebrew Bible. The first is called synonymous parallelism, and I've put that in the chat for you. The idea here is that each line, normally it's often in couplets or two, but sometimes it's more than that. Each line says essentially the same thing, but it's saying the same idea in a slightly different way. it comes at it from another angle so that it is reinforced in our mind as we read it. Let me give you an example. This is a verse from Psalm 25, verse 4. It says, "Show me your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths." So I hope you can see that that has the same idea in each line. Show me your ways. Teach me your paths. But by saying it using different words to communicate the same thought, it has a different effect when we read it. Okay, that is the idea of synonymous parallelism. The second type of parallelism that is used in the Hebrew scriptures, I will put here in the chat, is called antithetical parallelism. If any of you know your Greek and Latin stems, you may recognize anti means against or contrary to. So the idea here is that it's opposite of the synonymous. Rather than communicating the same idea, it communicates each successive line communicates a different idea that helps us understand something in a deeper way. So here's a good example from Proverbs 13, verse 4. "The sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied." So here we see a contrast between the sluggard or the lazy person and what they want versus set against the righteous person or the diligent or the prudent and what they want. The lazy person, the sluggard, never gets exactly the things that they're craving. But the righteous person or the diligent person is satisfied by the things that they desire because their desires are in the right place. So this is a good example of antithetical parallelism because it's two different examples that are helping us understand a deeper or a greater concept. The third and final form of parallelism that is employed is called formal or synthetic parallelism. It gets kind of tricky to say that too many times. Let me explain this before I example. The idea here is that the lines are really building on each other successively to spell out a comprehensive or cohesive, complete view of something bigger. So each line is a formal or synthetic. They are working together. Okay, they're working together to create something, but they're not saying the same thing. It's not like synonymous parallelism. So here's an example from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verse 9. It says, "Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit." And then building on that, "For anger resides in the lap of fools." Okay? So now we have seen examples of all three types of parallelism. And this will be very useful to you, not just as you prepare for the final exam, but also moving on in life as you read, especially the book of Proverbs. You will see this all over the place in the book of Proverbs. You will understand these guys are not just using different words to try to be tricky or to show how smart they are or because they're bored. They are doing this for a very intentional purpose. And this was central to the way that the Hebrew people tried to communicate, preserve, and cherish the wisdom that God had given to them through the ages and through various generations. Okay. Yeah, that's a good kind of overview there. There's one more word that we will come back to, which I just want to mention quickly. It is the word acrostic. I've put it in the chat. And the reason I'm mentioning this now is because sometimes when we read the Bible in English or perhaps in Kiswahili or another language, we are not interacting with the original letters, the original words that were written by the authors. And one of the things we miss, well, we miss several things. Oftentimes, the words will rhyme. Often there will be a meter or a rhythm to the lines, so that it has a da 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 da. That is a meter, the way that it is read. We also miss what's called alliteration, which is where each word has the similar sound to it. And acrostic is a type of poem wherein beginning of each line starts with the same letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, I will show you some images of this in a few moments when we get to the books with examples of this. But we miss all of these things when we're reading in English or in Kiswahili or whatever language you're reading in, because it has been translated. We even miss the beauty of the writing. Many of you will be familiar with what's called calligraphy today, and that's an anachronistic term to apply to the ancient manuscripts. But because manuscripts were so precious and they took so much time to do, the writing itself was very beautiful. It took a lot of time. It was very carefully done. And it's really a judgment on our own handwriting today. We tend to be very sloppy because we can type things on our computers or on our phones. So I say all these things now because I want to communicate to you the gravity of this literature, the way that it was revered and cherished and prized by the Hebrew people, and the reason why it was included in the Bible. It communicates the deep truths of God, and it helps us understand God. Again, I want to reiterate that because God, in his wisdom, created the world through wisdom, if we look at the world, and this includes other disciplines, perhaps some of you are studying biology or chemistry or mathematics or music or another type of science, geology, we can get a taste, a glimpse of the wisdom of God by looking at the ways that plants work and how cells fit together and how landscapes are formed and how molecules react and all of these different things. Okay, this is very much contained. This idea is contained in the wisdom literature. They did not have at that time, of course, what we would call today as science, modern science. But Solomon, whose name is very strongly associated with the wisdom literature, was known to be a person who was very interested in how the world worked and collected all these different things and thought about the ways that animals work and all of this type of stuff. Okay, so I want us to really approach this literature with that deep appreciation and that deep respect. Somebody had raised their hand briefly, and then the hand went down. You can go ahead and ask your question or make a comment now if you'd like. Reverend Kasoy, is there anything you'd like to say before we look at the book of Job?
I would say that every culture has its own way of teaching and of leaving an impact, or even dismantling arguments, strong arguments, step by step. Here in Africa, we tend to use repetition as a way of teaching, and that's how you leave an impression upon people. Because if you miss it the first point, you repeat it the second time, and the point comes home. And that is very much in line with that acrostic, that parallelism that you are learning, where the same idea is said and repeated from a different angle, and the whole idea or the whole concept is to drive the point home. So we also have to be conscious of our ways of learning and teaching and how we pass the information across and leave an impression. Thank you.
Very good. Yes. Thank you. Would anybody else have a comment they'd like to make or a question? Very good. So we have 5 main books, and then we'll talk briefly about the Book of Lamentations. And the first one is the Book of Job. Many people who are not Christians are familiar with the story and familiar with the figure, the character Job, and they know that he suffered, and sometimes he is caricatured as a person who suffers in a very kind of I don't know, passive or stoic manner. That is not the best depiction of Job. If you read the book, he actually becomes quite upset and voices his frustration to God. Okay, and the central idea, or one of the main questions of the book that it wrestles with, is what is called theodicy. I've put that word in the chat. It should actually be pronounced, well, in Greek, it's 2 words, theos and dike, which means justice or vindication or righteousness. And this idea is sometimes grouped in with discussions about the problem of evil, why people suffer. And Job really, and along with his friends and the other characters, really wrestle with this issue of why certain things happen, and most specifically in the case of Job, why bad things happen to good people. In the Psalms, the psalmist often asks God or wonders why good things are happening to bad people, why the wicked flourish. But in Job, the central question is, why are these bad things happening to Job, who is a righteous man? So let me very quickly summarize. Oh, Reverend Kasoy, go ahead.
Yeah, the simple way of defining theodicy is defending God's goodness in the midst of all the evil going on in the world.
Right.
Where you speak and insist that God is good, in spite and despite of all the evil that is taking place in the world. Because there are many people who question the goodness of God.
Right.
Even ourselves, as we go through many challenges of life, there are some who are tempted to question whether God is good, whether he loves them, whether he cares, and whether he is interested in their suffering, to that kind of a thing.
Very
so
good.
Defending the goodness of God in the midst of evil.
Yes. Thank you. The book of Job is very complex, and scholars have argued about it for a long time. In fact, it is often referred to as the oldest book of the Bible. That may be, well, at least in its entirety, as an entire book, it may be the oldest book in the Bible. There are probably perhaps other sections of other books that are a little bit older, but as an entire story, the book of Job is certainly one of the oldest or the older texts that we have in the Bible. And that's fitting, because humans, for as long as they have been around, have been asking this deep question of why is this bad thing happening when I don't feel like I deserve this, perhaps. At some point in everybody's life, maybe you've not gotten there yet, but you're going to have to wrestle with this deep question of why evil exists and how it's allowed to continue. Now, the example of Job is meant to be an extreme example, because Job is described at the beginning of the book as an extremely righteous person. He is so righteous that he even offers sacrifices for his children just in case they sinned and didn't know about it. Okay? And that's important to remember, because the what happens to Job is also exceptional. Okay, the ways that he is tested, we could say, are exceptional and unusual. And the reason that's important is because Job is described as more righteous than probably any of us would be willing to say we are. And the things that happen to him are probably worse than any of the things that have happened to any of us. He loses all of his wealth, all of his animals. He loses all of his children, his house, his health. Everything is taken away except his life. And because that he's more righteous than we are, and because the struggles, the trials he experiences are more than what we experience, that means all of us, every human who reads the story, can place their own experiences beneath and within the context of Job. And they say, well, I'm not as righteous as Job. I'm not experiencing these intense pains. So I need to understand my situation in light of what we learn from Job. Now, what happens, I need to summarize the plot very quickly. We're presented with this picture of Job as a very righteous person. And then we are shown the heavenly throne room or the council of God. There are other beings present, the sons of God. They are called, in the ancient world, that referred to lesser divine beings. And so normally Bible scholars think of these as angelic beings. And one of these angelic beings is called the Satan, Ha-Satan in Hebrew, but I'll put it in the chat. It's very important that we have the definite article. The word Satan in Hebrew means the accuser or the adversary or the opponent. And the role of this figure, we should not immediately jump to say right away that this is the Satan that we encounter in other places in Scripture. We want to focus on how it would have originally been understood by the original Hebrew readers, okay? This adversary, this opponent, his role was to basically oppose the people of God, to test them, and to ultimately, he's within the court of God, ultimately to operate in a way that draws people closer to God. And so God gives this person, the question is asked, is Job righteous because he's actually pure in his heart, or is he only righteous because you have made him wealthy, you have blessed him, and you have made him powerful? Okay, this is a very important question that we wrestle with as humans. And this is called disinterested righteousness by scholars. And so a proposal is made to strip from Job, strip away all of these things that God has blessed him with, and see if he is still going to be and still going to behave as a righteous person. And so that happens, and Job mourns, and three of his friends come and they mourn with him for the traditional period of 7 days. And then afterwards, they begin discussing how to understand what has happened to Job. And we are shown the traditional understanding of righteousness, of how these things worked in the ancient world, in the Hebrew mindset. The traditional understanding was this: if you are righteous, God will bless you. If you are wicked, you will receive bad things. You will be cursed. And this goes all the way back, I hope you remember, to Deuteronomy, where it has the blessings and the curses. So this is how people understood things. And they understood this in a reverse manner, in a way that we probably would not do today. If somebody was born as a cripple or with an ailment or a disease or something like this, they would conclude that that person had sinned or their parents had done something wicked to deserve this. Okay, this is the traditional understanding, and one of the purposes of Job is to shake this up, to demonstrate that this is not actually how the world works all of the time. In general, if you are righteous, God will bless you, and in general, if you are wicked, you will receive bad things, curses. You will be punished. You will suffer because of that. But there are always exceptions. And those exceptions are many times very difficult to comprehend. So Job's friends they basically conclude, Job, you must have sinned. You should search your heart. You should really pray and be honest with yourself to try to figure out where and how you sinned, how you upset God. And of course, it doesn't need much explanation. This is how the ancient world outside of Israel also operated. People understood if their crops grew well, then the gods must be pleased. If they had a bad harvest, then the gods must be angry at them. Okay, so the purpose of Job is to shake that up and to show that that's not always how things work. Sometimes righteous people will suffer. Sometimes wicked people will flourish. But the true question is, in the midst of our suffering, are we still going to behave righteously? Are we still going to bless God, honor God, and follow his ways for our life? Job's wife throughout the book encourages Job to curse God, be done with it, and die. But Job does not do that, although he also is very human in his response. He gets very angry and upset with God as he's trying to figure out why this is happening. And at the end of the book, God responds to Job. And this is one of the most beautiful pieces of poetry, I think, in the entire Bible. And I want to read it. I want to read several verses of Job chapter 38. And to do this, I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow along if you're able to see. We are going to go to Job 38. Now remember, this is God's response to Job after Job has accused God and done all these different things. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge? Get ready for a difficult task like a man. Or other translations say, brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you will inform me. And God says, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you possess understanding. Who set its measurements, if you know? Or who stretched out a measuring line across it? On what were its bases set? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang in chorus and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Who shut up the seas with doors when it burst forth, coming out of the womb? When I made the storm clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band? When I prescribed its limits and set in place its bolts and doors? When I said, to here you may come and no farther. Here your proud waves will be confined. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning or made the dawn know its place, that it might seize the corners of the earth and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features are dyed like a garment. Then from the wicked, the light is withheld. The arm raised in violence is broken. Have you gone to the springs that fill the sea, or walked about in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Have you seen the gates of deepest darkness? Have you considered the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know it all. So that's just the first few verses of that beautiful passage. And the conclusion that we are meant to draw, and the conclusion indeed that Job draws, is that God is beyond us. God's ways are higher than ours, as it says in another book of the Bible. And sometimes we will not understand how God is working or what God is doing or his ultimate purposes. But just because we don't understand doesn't mean that God has forgotten, and it does not make God any less righteous or any less holy. Okay, so we are led to conclude that that this is the ways of God are sovereign, and God is able to do what he wants, even though on the surface sometimes it does not make sense to us. And this connects to wisdom, because as I said earlier, many of the sayings of the wisdom literature on the surface do not make sense. Indeed, to young people or to people who are foolish or don't take time to think. It goes right over their heads. Wisdom requires us to reflect on life and to process events in community over a long, long period of time. Sometimes you will not be able to understand a struggle or a sickness or an obstacle until many years later, when you look back on that and you see how that experience was used by God to shape you, to test you, to make you stronger, or to draw you closer to him. Okay. Now, Job is wisdom literature, but contained within it are many other genres. Actually, there are laments, there are disputations, there are formal lawsuits that follow the pattern of how a lawsuit was conducted in the ancient world. There are hymns, there are petitions, avowals of innocence, affirmations of trust in God. And it's also important to know that this type of literature had found precedent in other ancient cultures. So in the 12th dynasty of Egypt, there was a work called the Admonitions of Upower, which is about almost 2000 BC, almost 4,000 years ago, okay? And it raises similar questions. In Babylon, there was a document that we call now the Babylonian Theodicy, where the central character is questioning the gods and why they are doing what they are doing, okay? This type of writing is very, very ancient, is very, very deep and very rich, because it wrestles with the fundamental struggles and questions and doubts of humanity as a whole. And as I said, many of us may not have yet had to confront these things, but when you do, when a close family member dies, or perhaps when you are cheated or betrayed, or perhaps if you contract an illness or a terminal disease, then these types of questions come to the surface. And that is when the book of Job demonstrates its profound wisdom in the midst of life's sufferings. That is the book of Job. We've only covered 1 out of our 5, so I want to keep moving, but that's okay, because Job is one of the most important. Kasoy, would you comment on anything, or should I continue with the Psalms?
You can continue with the Psalms, but one thing I like about the book of Job is the issue of integrity. It gets to a point where the wife has noticed, and the people who are close to us, they know us best. And the wife knows this man so well.
Yes.
And gets to the point of asking him, do you still insist on maintaining your integrity? And she saw that even in the midst of suffering, instead of cursing God, he maintained his integrity. And that I find valuable for us, that in the midst of what we are going through, the challenges of life, the testing of life, we still can maintain our integrity.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Very good. Thank you. So the next book that we get to in the wisdom literature is the book of Psalms. And many of us will be familiar with this book. The word psalm comes from the Greek word psalmoi, which means hymns or songs of praise. The Hebrew term for this book is Tehillim. And it's important to say again, these psalms come from quite a range. Some scholars believe that these psalms were composed over a period of 1,000 years and then collected together. Probably the most famous psalmist is King David, and there are 73 psalms which claim to be written by him. It's possible that he wrote more. It's possible that he wrote less, but there are other psalms that were probably written by other people. And in general, there are 3 main types of psalms that we can talk about. I'll mention a fourth in a little bit, but the three main types I put in the chat here are hymns, laments, and songs of thanksgiving. And one of the best ways to understand what the Psalms are accomplishing, or what their character is, that as opposed to other parts of Scripture that come from God, whether it's prophetic messages and warnings, or laws and commandments, the Psalms are expressions of humanity to God. Some of these expressions represent our joy and our praise of God. Some of them represent our pain and our suffering. That is the lament, our grief. And then others of them represent our thanksgiving, our response to God. And so these are generally the three main types of Psalms that we encounter in the book of Psalms. It's important to say that not only are many of these poetic in their written form, but they were composed in order to be sung by a group of people, by a community. Okay, we know this by several things. There are instructions that are given about the melodies and the instruments and how they were to be performed. The words rhyme, and again, they have this meter, and we are told about the context of how these were often sung and performed. And within the certainly the monarchy of King David, there would have been a group of paid, professional, very skilled musicians playing harps and lyres and tambourines and cymbals and other drums, as well as professional vocalists who would sing these songs. And so we should understand them as corporate expressions to God, in addition to identifying struggles that all of us wrestle with on an individual level. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier, well, let me say the fourth, another type of psalm that is not quite as common, is called the royal psalm. And one of the famous royal psalms is Psalm number 2. In these psalms, we understand more about the Old Testament concept of the Messiah, the Mashiach, which means the anointed one. So if you don't know, the New Testament term, it's actually a title that is given to Christ, given to Jesus. Christ is the title. Christos in Greek means anointed one. And that is connecting to the Old Testament concept of Mashiach, who came to be this expected figure in the later prophetic books. But in the Psalms, we see the king being anointed by God, being approved by God, being established by God as anointed, which means set apart or prepared to do a special task, to lead the people, to be a godly example, to govern the nation with justice and in righteousness. And so that is a very important concept for understanding the idea of Messiah in the Old Testament, these royal psalms. But that is kind of a less common type of psalm. I just wanted to mention it. Now, I told you earlier about the acrostic poem. And so I wanted to show you what an acrostic poem looks like in Hebrew. So I'm going to share my screen. Unfortunately, it doesn't work very well to share in my Bible software because for various reasons. So I have this image, and this will show you. I'm sorry, it's not the best image. Can you see this? I hope. I'm just trusting that you can. So.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Kasoy. Hebrew, the language is written from right to left. English and other modern languages are written from left to right, partly because of people being right-handed. But this is a small example of the first few verses of Psalm 119. So this letter right here is the Hebrew letter Aleph. This is Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, tet. And what happens is that the first 8 verses we see over here, you could, in this green bracket, they all start with the Hebrew letter Aleph going down, okay? And something else that's very important is that different words are also used. It's most of the time the word is not repeated. So it's the same letter, but a different word, which, as Reverend Kasoy mentioned, brings this repetition. Then at verse 9, after 8 stanzas, it switches to the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Bet, which is a B sound. And it goes down for the next 8 verses. Every line starts with Bet. And then at verse 17, it switches to the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Gimel, and so on and so forth. So the entire chapter has this pattern: 8 verses of one letter, 8 verses of the next letter, okay? Now, this is something interesting I found, an idea of what an acrostic might look like in English. Ah, blessed are those whose way is blameless. Also blessed. Always do no wrong. Above all, I, at the time, an upright heart, as I keep your statutes. And then it switches to be. Best be thou. And so, excuse me, you can see that this is a very, it's a very impressive and also very beautiful, especially when it is recited, because you hear the sounds of the letters being repeated. It's a very beautiful form of poetry. And we don't see this in our English translations because, because it doesn't really work quite correctly in English to do it this way. But I wanted you to understand how an acrostic operates. This is found in other places in the Bible, and especially in the Book of Lamentations, which we'll talk about shortly. So that is an example of an acrostic. I'm going to stop presenting here. And that really, for the sake of time, concludes my comments on the Psalms. Reverend Kasoy, would you want to add anything about the Book of Psalms?
No, thank you. We can progress on. It's a long one, and
yeah, very good.
Yeah.
So the next book that we get to in the canon is the Book of Proverbs. And I mentioned at the beginning that Proverbs has many of these short, pithy sayings. It's very, very hard to try to categorize. Some scholars have tried to do it, but mostly Proverbs is just a kind of an assortment of different sayings, except for the first several chapters, which, as I said, personify wisdom as a female figure who discusses the benefits of wisdom and describes the role of wisdom at the creation of the world when God was creating things, okay? Proverbs, again, it's important to reiterate that it has the fear of the Lord, or the fear of God, as the basis of wisdom. So everything here is in context or in the relation to the God of Israel. And that's important to say because there is very, very strong resemblance in many of the Proverbs to ancient wisdom, and especially Egyptian wisdom. There is an ancient Egyptian work that was designed for instructing people who worked in the court of the Pharaoh, helping them understand how they should behave, how they should act in order to not anger the Pharaoh, in order to be a good servant. Many of the Proverbs have strong resemblance there, but they are not mere copies. They are given and offered in the context of the God of Israel, and they recognize that that behaving in a certain way in God's presence as we live our lives is also very beneficial. And at this point, I should also mention, we touched on this very briefly, I think, when we were talking about Exodus, the way that Moses was educated in the house of Pharaoh. And also, if you recall, Joseph was also educated and received instruction in the house of Pharaoh. And so as Christians, as people who worship God, we don't have to conclude that people who are non-believers, people who are not Christians, we don't have to conclude that they are completely void of wisdom. As I said earlier, many of the ideas in the wisdom literature suggest that people might come to appreciate the wisdom contained in the world through science and music and biology and chemistry and mathematics. And as they appreciate that wisdom that God has put into the world, they might be drawn towards the Creator God himself. Indeed, this has happened in many places throughout history with many figures who have first studied something like physics or astronomy and then have been led to God. And the wonderful example, maybe the paradigmatic example of this, comes in the New Testament when there are there are wise men. Traditionally there are three, but wise men come from the east, and they're drawn to Jesus because of their study and their knowledge of the stars, because they saw the star in heaven. Okay, so wisdom can be found in places outside the church. Wisdom will not save us. Wisdom does not equal salvation, but some forms of wisdom can be found outside of the church, and God intends for that wisdom to draw people to himself. Okay. There are several different representative kind of ideas of Proverbs. As I said before, many of them talk about, they juxtapose wise people with foolish people. They juxtapose the wicked with the righteous. They juxtapose sometimes wealthy people with poor people and how they're living. But a very important thing to say, as we are just doing a very quick summary of this, it has to do with righteous and wicked. In our world today, many people understand righteousness and wickedness in moral categories in terms of actions. You know, whether I do certain things sexually, or drink alcohol, or cheat, or steal money, or these types of things. And that is certainly part of it. But one dimension that we often miss in our modern contexts is the relational dimension. And in the ancient world, righteousness and wickedness were maybe primarily understood in terms of how you treated other people. And so we see in the wisdom literature, especially in Proverbs, righteous people are those who treat others with fairness, with kindness, with dignity, with respect. And wicked people are those who cheat their neighbor, who betray their own family members, who deceive rulers, and who try to trick for their own advantage in order to to get ahead of other people. So it's very important to think about righteousness and wickedness in terms of our relationships with other people in our families, in our communities, and in the governing bodies that we interact with. I want to provide just one example. This is one of my favorite proverbs in the book, and I love it because it seems on the surface to be initially contradictory or paradoxical. Okay, this is what it says. The proverb is 26, verses 4 and 5. It says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you yourself also be like him." Then it says in verse 5, "Do answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own opinion." So we have two things that say, don't answer a fool, do answer a fool. And one of the conclusions that is drawn by reading the wisdom literature is that there is no simple, universal way to apply wisdom. Part of being wise means that we understand the appropriate times to act in certain ways and the appropriate times to act in other ways. And we have to decide based upon our experience, based upon our own practice of becoming wise and cultivating understanding, when are the right moments to do certain things. And we are going to see next in the book of Ecclesiastes a very famous passage talking about seasons for different times. So I'm just going to move on and cover very quickly Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, and then we can wrap up with questions. Ecclesiastes is a very interesting contrast to the book of Proverbs, because in general, Proverbs seems to uphold the traditional notion of wisdom that I told you about. Job's friends in the book of Job, they were upholding. Proverbs seems to endorse the idea that if you behave righteously, good things will happen. If you behave wickedly, bad things are going to happen. Proverbs says that over and over and over again. Proverbs also, on the whole, is very optimistic and positive. It's positive about the flourishing and the blessing of the righteous, and it's also positive about the punishment and the judgment that is delivered to the wicked. Ecclesiastes is quite a bit different. It communicates a more pessimistic tone, a more doubtful tone, even a rebellious tone that is questioning the generational wisdom that has been passed down. So the writer of Ecclesiastes, the Hebrew term is Kohelet. I'm going to put that in the chat because it's a little bit different. I don't think any of us have any brothers or sisters named Kohelet. And this word means something like teacher or somebody who collects ideas is the etymology. We have good reason. Traditionally, it's been connected with King Solomon. And there is good reason to believe that King Solomon did indeed write the book of Ecclesiastes. But the important thing to remember is that this person in the book of Ecclesiastes is largely confronting or doubting or questioning the traditional wisdom that he has been taught, precisely because he has seen so many exceptions, so many instances where things don't make sense, where there is needless suffering, or where righteous people are being suffering, or where wicked people are flourishing. Okay, so that is summarized or encapsulated in one of the most famous refrains of the book, which happens at the beginning and at the end, which is meaningless, meaningless. All of these things are meaningless. And the author wrestles and struggles with this idea. I want to read the very famous passage which comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. This has been made into songs and other things. It's only 8 verses long. It says this: "For everything there is an appointed time or season, an appropriate period for every activity on earth, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There is a time to search and a time to give something up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to rip, a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace." So this reinforces that idea that I had introduced in that proverb, that different moments in life, different seasons call for different behavior, and wisdom involves knowing which season of life we are in so that we can act appropriately to that season. Some scholars think that the author of Ecclesiastes is going through a period of life himself where he is upset or uncontent with the wisdom that he has been taught. But ultimately, he comes back around to understanding and reaffirming the fear of the Lord and the importance of living righteously, even when we don't understand it, even when it doesn't make complete sense. Very quickly, I'm going to just talk about the Book of Lamentations, which is sometimes traditionally attributed to the prophet Jeremiah. Modern scholars tend to think that it was written by somebody else, but probably around the fall of the city of Jerusalem, the capture of Jerusalem by Babylon. And so it represents this lament, this mourning or this grieving about what has happened. And I want to say, oh no, I forgot the Song of Songs. Uh-oh. Let me go back. The Song of Songs is the Song of Solomon. Sorry, everybody. Is the final 5 list of the main wisdom and poetic books. It's basically Song of Songs means the greatest song. And most scholars agree that it's set within the context of a wedding. Fundamentally, Song of Songs is a celebration of love. But there are two layers. And many Jews, as well as many of the early Christians, read this book allegorically because it talks about love between a young man and a young woman, but they understood it allegorically. The Jews understood it to be talking about God's love for his people Israel, and then the Christians understood this as Christ's love for his church. And it certainly works in that context. But what I want to say, just a very brief comment about this, is that there is increasing need, I think, to understand this book in a literal way, because so many young people get their understanding about sexuality from non-Christian sources, from media, from movies, from shows, and from celebrities. And that is not always the best way. The church has been reluctant to talk about sexuality for many, many years. And that is understandable in one sense, but also unfortunate in another sense, because it is God who created our sexuality, and it is good. And so Song of Songs celebrates young love that is pure, that has been saved for our spouse. And so it celebrates the beauty and the innocence of love that has not been spoiled, that has not been awakened too early. And one of my favorite kind of analogies about sexual love in its good form is to talk about a fire. If you have a fire that is contained within a stone circle, or within an oven, or within a hearth in your home, then it is very, very good and very pleasing. It can keep us warm. It can cook our food. It can be enjoyable and comforting to watch. It can even scare away animals and predators. But if that fire gets outside of its contained, constrained, bounded place, it can be very destructive. It can be very painful. It can be very, very bad. And that is also what is true of our sexuality, of our sexual love. If it is contained within the bounds of a godly marriage, and it is saved for one person, it is one of the most beautiful and good and pure things on earth. But if it is not kept in that bounded place where it is meant to be, it can become utterly destructive and painful and even violent and tragic. And I don't need to go into examples of how that works itself out. Now, very quickly, I was saying about the Book of Lamentations. The reason it is worth mentioning is because our world today, modern people, do not know very well how to grieve. Perhaps some of you would have insight into traditional cultures in Africa, because I know that they still process grief and pain and loss in traditional ways that are healthier. But there are two bad things, two unfortunate things that happen about the way we process pain in our world today. One is that many people try to do it alone, by themselves, in an isolated way. And what often happens is that the grief overwhelms them. The loss of a loved one or the evil of the world is not meant to be handled or processed by one person alone. And so it overwhelms the individual if you're trying to process grief by yourself. And the second problem that occurs is that some people try to suppress or cover up or ignore grief. They don't let it be expressed in a way that it needs to. As humans, God has created us in a way so that when grief, pain happens, it needs to be expressed. It needs to come out of us, and it needs to take a form in order that we can move on and heal from what has happened. Lamentations provides the proper way to do this. It is a communal expression of grief for what has happened, mourning about something bigger than the individual. And it is expressed in a way that gives full recognition to what has happened. It doesn't try to ignore it. It doesn't try to cover it up. It doesn't try to make it less than what it is. It gives full credence to the pain and the suffering and the grief that has happened. And in that process, it directs the grief towards God. And it demonstrates that in that manner, God hears our grieving, he hears our lament, and he is able to comfort us and to help us move on after seasons of grief. And that is wisdom. That is wise. And we would do well to heed that advice about how to process grief and pain in our life. That concludes the wisdom and poetic literature, and it concludes my lecture. I would now like to turn things over to Reverend Kasoy, and then if anybody has a comment, we can or a question, we can hear those. Thank you.